A single whooping crane stands 5 feet tall in the shallows, snow white against the gray Texas marsh, its bugling call carrying for miles across the water. In the mid-1940s, scientists conducting a census fully expected to confirm what everyone already assumed, that this bird was gone. Instead, they counted 21 birds. A century earlier, between 2,200 and 1,500 whooping cranes ranged across North America. Within a single human lifetime, 98% had vanished. And then the scientists who found those 21 survivors decided to try something no one had ever attempted before. Today, over 800 whooping cranes exist on Earth. The story of how is stranger than fiction. The whooping crane's extreme specialization would later become the exact thing that defined its brush with extinction. But in the mid-1800s, it was just a bird doing what it had always done. Standing up to 5 feet tall with a wingspan stretching 7.5 feet, the whooping crane is the tallest bird in North America. Its name comes directly from its call, a resonant, bugling whoop that carries for miles across open wetland. That call evolved over millennia as a marker of territory and pair bonding in wide, undisturbed marsh country. These birds weren't built for a crowded world, they were built for a vast and quiet one. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The very traits that made whooping cranes so striking, their size, their loyalty, their demanding habitat requirements, also made them extraordinarily fragile as a population. Whooping cranes mate for life. A pair raises only one chick per year, and even that is not guaranteed. They require enormous tracts of undisturbed wetland to breed successfully, and they tolerate almost no human intrusion during nesting season. Every one of those traits, perfectly suited to a pristine continent, became a liability the moment that continent started changing. Their migration route was one of the longest in North America, roughly 2,500 miles each way between their breeding grounds in the boreal wetlands of northern Canada and their wintering grounds on the Gulf Coast of Texas. That journey crossed the entire Great Plains, threading through prairies, river valleys, and farmland. Twice a year, every bird in the species ran a gauntlet. I mean, think about that for a second. The entire global population of a species making a 1,500-mile journey through increasingly hostile terrain twice a year, every year, with a reproductive rate so low that losing even a handful of birds could set the population back by years. Everything was in place. The whooping crane just didn't know what everything was building toward. Everything the whooping crane had built was about to work against them. The prairie was full of them once. In the mid-1800s, an estimated 1,200 to 1,500 whooping cranes ranged across the breadth of North America, nesting in the northern wetlands, wintering along the Gulf, and filling the flyway between with their unmistakable white forms and carrying calls. Settlers moving west in the 1840s and 1850s would have seen them in numbers that made the species seem permanent, untouchable, like the bison, like the passenger pigeon, like every other creature that seemed too abundant to ever disappear. That assumption was wrong, and it was wrong in the same way it was always wrong, gradually, then catastrophically. Mechanism of collapse was not a single event, but a convergence of pressures that hit the whooping crane from every direction simultaneously. Westward expansion brought agriculture into the heart of the Great Plains, and agriculture meant wetland drainage. The birds didn't just lose wintering habitat or breeding habitat, they lost the connective tissue of their entire migration route. Every drained marsh was one less safe place to land, feed, and rest on a journey that already demanded everything the species had. Market hunting compounded the destruction. In the second half of the 19th century, large conspicuous birds were shot for food, for sport, and for the feather trade. Whooping cranes, standing 5 feet tall and gleaming white against any background, were not difficult targets. The legal frameworks that would eventually shield migratory birds, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, wouldn't arrive until 1918, simply didn't exist yet. Hunters shot them along the flyway at stopover sites on the wintering grounds. Every bird killed was a bird that would never breed, never raise a chick, never add to a population that was already struggling to replace itself. By 1900, the count had dropped to approximately 100 birds. 100! From a peak of up to 1,500, that represented a 93% loss in roughly 50 years. A population collapse of that speed and scale, in a species with a reproductive rate this low, is nearly impossible to reverse through natural processes alone. Each breeding pair produces at most one surviving chick per year. Losing 100 birds requires years of successful breeding just to break even. The math was already working against the crane before anyone was paying serious attention. What made the situation even more precarious was that the species wasn't a single unified population. Two distinct wild groups existed: the migratory flock that wintered on the Texas Gulf Coast and bred in the far north, and a smaller, non-migratory resident flock that lived year-round in coastal Louisiana. The Louisiana birds were geographically isolated from the migratory population, separated by habit and range, and they were already in serious trouble by the early 20th century. Their coastal marsh habitat was being steadily degraded, their numbers were thin, and they had no demographic buffer, no influx from the larger migratory group to offset losses. Then came 1940. A powerful hurricane tore through coastal Louisiana in August of that year, ripping through the exact habitat where the resident flock had been clinging to existence. The storm didn't just damage the marsh, it shredded the social structure of a population that was already too small to absorb any shock. The Louisiana birds, already reduced to a handful of individuals, were decimated almost overnight. A flock that had once been a distinct and genetically significant part of the species was effectively destroyed by a single weather event. By the mid-1940s, when scientists finally conducted a rigorous census of the entire species, the number came back at 21 wild birds. 21. The Louisiana flock was gone for all practical purposes. Only the migratory group remained, and it was hanging by a thread so thin that a single bad storm, a single disease outbreak, or a single unlucky migration season could have snapped it entirely. Species had gone from filling the prairie to fitting in a single room. After the hurricane tore through Louisiana in 1940, the resident flock didn't disappear all at once. A few birds lingered in the coastal marshes, scattered survivors of a population that no longer had the critical mass to function as a breeding group. They were alive, but they were ecologically finished, individuals without a future, haunting the edges of habitat that could no longer sustain them. For years, wildlife managers watched these last Louisiana cranes with a mixture of hope and dread, hoping that somehow a pair might form, knowing that the odds were essentially zero. One bird outlasted all the others. Wildlife managers and ornithologists who tracked the remaining Louisiana cranes eventually settled on a nickname for the last survivor, Mac. Mac was a lone crane. No mate, no flock, no prospect of either. He moved through the Louisiana marshes in a kind of biological solitude that had no resolution. There was no female to find, no territory to defend in any meaningful sense, no chick that would ever carry his genetics forward. He was the end of a line that stretched back thousands of years, and he was living out alone in a shrinking piece of coastal wetland. If that sounds bad, keep watching. The decision that wildlife managers faced in 1950 was one of the hardest in the early history of American conservation. Mac was still alive. He was a wild bird, and removing him from the wild meant ending whatever slim theoretical possibility remained that the Louisiana population could somehow reconstitute itself. But leaving him in the wild meant watching him live out his remaining years in isolation, contributing nothing to the survival of his species and dying without a trace. There was no good option. There was only a less bad one. In 1950, the decision was made to capture Mac and remove him from the wild entirely. He was taken into human care, the last of his kind from a population that had existed on the Louisiana coast for as long as anyone could document. His removal was not a rescue in the triumphant sense. It was a reckoning. It forced the people responsible for the species to confront a question that passive conservation had been avoiding for years. What does it mean to protect a wild animal when the wild can no longer sustain it? The Migratory Bird Treaty Act had been on the books since 1918. Aransas National Wildlife Refuge had been established in 1937 specifically to protect whooping crane wintering habitat. Laws existed, protected land existed, and the species had still dropped to 21 birds. The framework of protection, keep humans away, preserve the habitat, let nature do the rest, had reached the absolute limit of what it could accomplish. Mac's capture was the proof. Passive protection could hold the line, but it could not rebuild a population from the edge of nothing. What came next would have to be something entirely different. Something that had never been tried with this species, and barely tried with any species. The tools didn't exist yet. The knowledge didn't exist yet. The people who would eventually develop both were, in 1950, still years away from the breakthroughs that would change everything. Mac's story ended quietly. He lived out his days in captivity, the last representative of a population that a hurricane and a century of habitat loss had erased. But his capture marked the moment when the conservation of the whooping crane shifted from passive to active, from protecting what remained to actively rebuilding what had been lost. That shift, painful and uncertain as it was, is the reason the story didn't end in the 1950s. Picture a narrow strip of coastal marsh on the Texas Gulf Coast, salt flats, cordgrass, shallow bays, and tidal flats stretching along the arc of the Aransas Peninsula. Every November, after a 2,500-mile migration from the boreal wetlands of northern Canada, the entire surviving population of wild whooping cranes funneled into this single location. All of them, every bird that existed. For months each winter, the fate of the species rested in one place, on one piece of ground, exposed to every threat that coastal Texas could produce. Aransas National Wildlife Refuge had been established in 1937, making it one of the earliest deliberate efforts in American conservation to hold specific ground for a specific endangered species. The timing was not accidental. By the late 1930s, ornithologists and wildlife managers were already alarmed by the trajectory of whooping crane numbers, and Aransas represented one reliable location where the migratory flock could be monitored, counted, and at least partially shielded from direct human disturbance. The refuge gave the birds a protected wintering ground. It did not give them anything close to safety. The clock was already ticking. The whooping crane just couldn't hear it yet. The concentration of the entire species in a single wintering location was a structural vulnerability that no amount of protection could fully address. One major hurricane making landfall on the Aransas coast at the wrong time of year could have eliminated the species in an afternoon. One significant industrial accident, an oil spill in the shallow bays where the cranes foraged for blue crabs, their primary winter food source, could have poisoned the feeding grounds that kept the flock alive through the winter months. The cranes were protected on paper. They were still catastrophically exposed in practice. The migration corridor itself was its own gauntlet. The 2,500-mile route between Wood Buffalo National Park and Canada's Northwest Territories and Aransas on the Texas Gulf Coast crossed the entire length of the Great Plains, through Saskatchewan, across the Dakotas and Nebraska, through Kansas and Oklahoma, and finally into Texas. Along that route, the birds faced power lines strung across river valleys and wetland margins. They faced weather systems that could ground migration or scatter a flock across unfamiliar terrain. Every mile of that route was a mile where something could go wrong, so yeah, not great, and the numbers made every risk feel existential. With only 21 birds in the mid-1940s, the loss of even 2 or 3 individuals in a single season could represent a 10 or 15% reduction in the entire global population of the species. There was no buffer. There was no reserve population somewhere else that could absorb the losses. There was just the flock, the corridor, and the winter ground at Aransas. Protecting Aransas bought time. It was a necessary foundation. Without it, the flock would almost certainly have collapsed entirely before any other intervention could take hold. But with 21 birds, one breeding ground buried somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, and a migration route that crossed half a continent twice a year, time alone was not a strategy. Something more was needed, something more radical. The same singular dependence on one strip of coastal marsh that had kept the whooping crane alive through the worst decades was about to become the argument for doing something far more ambitious. There is a particular kind of scientific problem that looks impossible until someone decides to stop treating it as impossible. Breeding whooping cranes in captivity was that kind of problem. No one had ever successfully done it. The birds had been held in zoos and facilities before, but whooping cranes in captivity had never produced viable, surviving offspring. There was no protocol, no established diet, no enclosure design that was known to work. People who took on the challenge in the 1960s and 1970s were building the methodology from scratch in real time, with a species that had almost no margin for error. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. The key insight that made the entire captive breeding program viable came from a careful observation of wild crane behavior. Whooping cranes typically lay 2 eggs per clutch, but in the wild, they almost invariably raise only 1 chick. The second egg is not incubated with equal investment. One chick typically outcompetes the other in the nest, and the weaker one does not survive. The wild pair would still raise their 1 chick. The harvested egg would become a captive raised bird. Net gain, 1 crane per nest per season, extracted from a resource that would otherwise go unused. That insight was elegant in theory. Executing it was something else entirely. Patuxent Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland became the hub of the early breeding effort, operating under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and later in coordination with other facilities. They developed specialized diets for captive cranes at different life stages. They redesigned enclosures to reduce stress behaviors that were suppressing breeding activity. Every variable was a potential failure point, and every failure cost time that the species didn't have in abundance. The International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin joined as a critical partner. Founded in 1973 by ornithologists George Archibald and Ron Sowie, the ICF brought additional expertise and, critically, additional birds. Maintaining genetic diversity across a captive population, this small required careful management of which birds bred with which, and pooling animals across multiple facilities gave managers more options. A captive population that was genetically bottlenecked, where a handful of founders contributed the overwhelming majority of the genetic material, would be biologically fragile in ways that might not become apparent for generations. Archibald and his colleagues understood this, and they structured the captive program accordingly. The decades of work at Patuxent and the ICF eventually produced consistent results, reliable hatching, surviving chicks, and a growing captive population that could serve as a genetic reservoir for the species. But a crane raised in captivity by human handlers was not automatically a crane that could survive in the wild. That problem, the problem of wildness itself, was still waiting to be solved. The first large creature a whooping crane chick sees after hatching becomes, in the bird's developing brain, the template for what a whooping crane is. This is imprinting, a hardwired learning mechanism that evolution built into precocial birds to ensure that chicks bond with their parents and learn from them during the critical early weeks of life. If that chick's first large creature was a human researcher in a lab coat, the bird would grow up associating humans with safety, food, and social belonging. Released into the wild, it would approach humans without fear, fail to integrate with other cranes, and almost certainly die. The solution that biologists developed was one of the more remarkable pieces of applied behavioral science in conservation history. Handlers working with whooping crane chicks wore full-body white crane costumes, covering the entire human form, including the face, and used hand puppets shaped and colored like adult whooping crane heads to feed and interact with the chicks. From the moment of hatching, the chick saw nothing that looked like a human being. It saw large white shapes that moved and fed it in ways that mimicked crane behavior as closely as research could manage. Vocalization was handled with equal care. Whooping crane calls, the contact calls, the alarm calls, the feeding calls that chicks need to learn in order to function in a flock were recorded from wild and captive cranes and played through speakers in the rearing enclosures. Chicks grew up hearing crane vocalizations constantly, learning the acoustic vocabulary of their species without ever hearing a human voice in a context that the bird might associate with a social partner. Every sound in the chick's environment was a crane sound. Every large moving object was a crane shape. The behavioral choreography extended to feeding technique, movement patterns, and social interaction. Handlers using the puppet heads would demonstrate foraging behavior, probing the puppet into shallow water, picking up food items to teach chicks how to find and process food in a wetland environment. The goal was not simply to prevent imprinting on humans. The goal was to produce a bird that was, behaviorally and psychologically, as close to wild raised as captive rearing could achieve. A bird that was wary of humans, competent at foraging, capable of reading the social signals of other cranes, and ready to function in the real world. The results were measurable. Birds raised under the costume protocol showed appropriate fear responses to humans, integrated more successfully with other cranes after release, and demonstrated foraging competence in field conditions. The costume science worked, but there was still one problem that no amount of behavioral conditioning in a rearing enclosure could solve. A crane raised in captivity in Wisconsin had no idea how to migrate, and migration for a whooping crane was not optional. Read that again. A crane raised in captivity had no idea how to migrate. Migration in whooping cranes is not a purely instinctive behavior encoded in every detail. The general urge to move south in autumn is innate, but the specific route, the specific stopover sites, the specific destination at the end of a long 200-mile journey is learned. Captive raised cranes had no parents to follow. They had the urge to migrate and nowhere to go. The real question is what happened behind closed doors. The answer, when it came, was one of the most creative and logistically audacious interventions in conservation history. If the cranes needed a parent to follow, conservationists would build one. Not a biological parent, a costumed human pilot in an ultralight aircraft. Operation Migration was a cross-border coalition of pilots, biologists, and conservation organizations that began conducting guided migration flights in the late 1990s and continued into the 2000s and beyond. The program worked like this. Juvenile whooping cranes, raised under the costume protocol at breeding facilities in Wisconsin, were conditioned from early in life to follow an ultralight aircraft piloted by a costumed handler. Over a series of days and weeks, the ultralight led the juvenile flock from Nissida National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin southward along a historic migration corridor to Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge on the Gulf Coast of Florida, a journey of over 200 miles. What happened the following spring was the proof that the program worked. The cranes that had completed the guided southward migration flew north on their own. Without the ultralight, without a guide, they retraced the route they had learned the previous autumn and returned to Wisconsin. They remembered. The migration was now encoded in their experience, transferable to subsequent seasons, and critically, teachable to their own offspring if the birds eventually bred successfully in the wild. Over the years that Operation Migration ran, it established a new eastern migratory flock of whooping cranes, a population that had not existed anywhere in the wild for over a century. Birds that had been raised in captivity in Wisconsin were now flying a migration route through the eastern United States, wintering in Florida, and returning north each spring. A population built from zero, using methods that had been invented specifically for this purpose, was functioning in the wild. The program was eventually restructured as new techniques for teaching migration emerged, including the use of motorized ground vehicles and revised release strategies. But the core achievement of Operation Migration stands as one of the most extraordinary feats of applied conservation ever attempted, teaching a species to migrate by becoming, in costume and aircraft, the parent it never had. The eastern migratory flock existed, Wisconsin to Florida and back, a route carved out of nothing. Every spring, the migratory flock vanished north into Canada, and for years, no one knew exactly where they went. The breeding ground was a blank on the map, somewhere in the vast boreal wilderness, but unlocated, unprotected, and unknown. Whooping crane nests. The breeding ground had been hiding in plain sight, buried in one of the most remote and inaccessible landscapes on the continent. Shallow lakes, real muskeg, and dense spruce forests so far from any road or settlement that decades of searching had simply missed it. Wood Buffalo National Park, already established and protected by the Canadian government, became the northern anchor of the species' recovery. The discovery meant that the whooping crane's survival was now a shared responsibility between two countries, Canada protecting the breeding ground, the United States protecting the wintering ground and the migration corridor between them. The cranes didn't respect political borders, and the science couldn't either. The breeding ground was no longer a mystery. Now it had to be protected, monitored, and integrated into every decision made about the species on both sides of the border. The recovery of the whooping crane was never going to be contained within one country's jurisdiction. The discovery at Wood Buffalo made that structurally undeniable. From 21 birds to 831, subscribe so you don't miss the next species pulled back from the edge.